Welcome to the session of Inclusive and Evidence-Based Practice. In this presentation, I'll focus on the terms of inclusive and evidence-based practice, what they mean, and their importance when considering the selection of a particular strategy or an intervention. The areas of developmental disabilities and autism have always attracted a multitude of interventions that target the learning and behavioural needs of children with these disorders. Interestingly, autism has attracted a variety of philosophies and approaches since its first description by Kanner in 1943. Firstly, there were psychodynamic theories which tried to explain the cause of autism, and this involved implicating the style of parenting as the cause of the autism, and during this period the term refrigerator mother was coined. In more recent times, interventions have involved special education practices and behavioural interventions. Some practices have also employed pharmacological treatments. Despite the interventions and treatments considered to address the need of the child, the treatment needs to be comprehensive and holistic and tailored to their individual needs. According to Campbell, Shopler, Cueva and Hallen, for young children with ASD, the intervention is more likely to address developing language and communication, special education skills, working with parents, and specific behavioural strategies to target symptoms. We might find that for adolescents with ASD, interventions are selected to target maybe the characteristics of depression, anxiety, behaviour and cognitive therapy, and maybe even some obsessive-compulsive symptoms. According to research, evidence-based practices for individuals with ASD are therapies and treatments that have gone through rigorous research and review and have been found to be effective for treating individuals with ASD. The evidence-based practice should always be strengths-focused, individualised, and focused on achieving meaningful outcomes. It needs to be implemented immediately, consistently, accurately, and evaluated. It is important to remember, though, that the goal of the chosen evidence-based practice is not a cure, but a strategy or an approach that is going to address the symptoms or the characteristics of ASD. So what is deemed evidence-based practice? And generally, the way that we look at this or explain this is to use a scientific approach and the way that we test something that is evidence-based. So these main dot points that you see on this slide help explain some of the indicators that we would use to deem a practice or a strategy that is evidence-based. However, things that don't count as evidence-based are personal testimonials, even from parents. The word of an authority figure, maybe a professional, can sometimes give conflicting advice, or the collective opinion of a group of professionals. So here we need to be very careful about conflict of interest. Therefore, we ensure that when we refer to evidence-based practice, we're trying to look at strategies that have been drawn from research that has been published and that has undergone a peer review process in some form of noteworthy journal or a publication. And so we look at research studies where merit is given and where publication has been peer reviewed and published. We also need to consider here that sometimes studies are a single study, such as a case study. They may not gain full acceptance or have as high recognition as studies where there has been a large group research undertaken. So researchers have extensively investigated this area and have asked the question of what makes a practice or intervention controversial. McWilliam, back in 1999, and Finn, Bothan Bramlett in 2005 have discussed a range of criteria that may deem an intervention controversial. The criteria which makes these researchers use are helpful in assisting practitioners, educators, and key interventionists to make an objective and informed decision when working with families and collectively making decisions about the adoption of a particular intervention. Let's look at the work by McWilliam, and in his article he uses the term controversial or noteworthy. And by controversial we mean a practice is not evidence-based, and noteworthy meaning a practice is evidence-based. In his article, he discusses and unpacks 5 criteria, and a practice would be deemed controversial if it actually fitted one or more of the criteria that you see here on this slide. So cure claim means if a practice is claimed to cure a disability that rhetorically cannot be cured, it is controversial. Practitioner specialisation. If a practice requires people who are already specialists to undergo even more training, it is probably controversial. That's not to say that some practices may require some professional development or workshopping, but not to undergo hours and hours of training when that professional already has qualifications to work with individuals with ASD. Questionable research. Now, a major link between the research and practice is the theoretical framework and the scientific methodology that underpins the research and findings. So we need to ensure that this strategy or the intervention has undergone rigorous research where there has been several trials, there has been large study groups that the researchers, there is no link towards between the researchers and maybe that particular funding body, for example. We need to ensure there's no conflict of interest here. Intensity. Any therapeutic practice can become controversial when it stipulates a set amount of intervention per week. Because what this usually does, and let's look at this through the lens of the families, it can raise their hope and expectations that this therapy will be effective or possibly cure the condition. This works on the view of more is better, which most families become attracted to. And everything comes at a cost. And when an intervention requires more time, there is always more of a dollar value attached to this intervention. So it does become costly. And finally, legal action. As soon as a practice becomes scrutinised within our court system, the merits and credibility are questioned, and it is controversial. So there are several interventions which have been debated in the legal system, some of which are applied behaviour analysis and functional communication, or FC. Now, according to McWilliam, if a practice or an intervention meets one of these 5 criteria, it is likely to be controversial. However, if it meets more than one criteria, it will most certainly qualify as an intervention that is controversial. Let's now look at Von Both and Bramlett's criteria. And they've actually added 4 more. So they've really unpacked McWilliam's criteria a little bit more. So their first criteria is untestable. So is the treatment unable to be tested or disproved? The second one is unchanged. And what they mean here is, does the treatment approach or the strategy remain unchanged even in the face of contradictory evidence? Confirming evidence. Is the rationale for the treatment approach based only on confirming evidence, with disconfirming evidence ignored or minimised? Inadequate evidence. Are the treatment claims incommensurate with the level of evidence needed to support those claims? Avoiding peer review. Are treatment claims unsupported by evidence that has undergone critical scrutiny? Disconnected. Is the treatment approach disconnected from well-established scientific models or paradigms? New terms. Is the treatment described by terms that appear to be scientific, but upon further examination are found not to be scientific at all? Grandiose outcomes. Is the treatment approach based on grandiose claims or poorly specified outcomes? And finally, holistic. Is the treatment claimed to make sense only within a vaguely described holistic framework? So really what you've seen here with Finn et al.'s criteria, they've really unpacked that criteria of McWilliam of questionable research, where the research needs to be testable, that we need to see that what is the evidence we're looking for that the strategy that is being tested is making a difference to the student or the young child with ASD. We also need to ensure here that what Finn et al. Is highlighting, that the strategy or the intervention that has been selected has undergone rigorous research. And so it's been explained and discussed in peer-reviewed journals. So while it's important for us to consider using evidence-based strategies and interventions, another element that we need to consider is how inclusive this practice is. So is it an inclusive strategy? So what I've outlined here are a number of elements that I consider to be inclusive, or what makes a practice inclusive. The first element is holistic, and that is that the actual strategy or the intervention is teaching the child a range of skills that can be applied in a range of contexts. So it's holistic to the child's everyday existence. Connectedness. What I would be interested here in when I look at strategies is the intervention going to enable the young child or the student to work and connect with different people in different situations? More importantly, is it connecting the child to their routines in the day? So it's considering the routines of the child. Adapted. The intervention or the strategy being recommended can still work for the student, even if parts of the protocol are modified to suit the context and needs of the student. And to me, this is really important because what we're doing here is we're personalising the strategy and the intervention to the child's needs. Participation. What we mean here is that it's allowing a range of people to participate and encourage the child to use this strategy in a range of situations. So it's allowing the integration aid, it's allowing the teacher, the parents, any person who works with this student will be able to work with the student using this particular strategy or approach. Implementation. So here we're actually allowing the strategy to be implemented by all people, but more helpful if people have done a short course or some form of workshopping by an accredited personnel. Resources. So what we mean here, it may require the resources such as teacher in services to learn about the application of the strategy, or enabling teachers to work with already available materials and resources in the schools, such as numeracy and literacy kits, picture and symbol icons, and other reinforcers that a school may already have. So it's not relying on the purchase of more expensive materials and resources. And finally, generalization, that the recommended intervention or strategy builds in the teaching of social communication, behavior, and cognition in all contexts of the school day and home life. So what we want to see here is that the strategy that is being addressed and used to focus on a particular skill is actually going to have some level of importance, not only at school, but also in the home and community life of that student. So making a decision about which intervention or practice is going to be considered by the team supporting the learner with ASD can be rather challenging. And so the team will engage in a critique or an analysis of an evidence-based practice. And this is going to be crucial given that the wide range of interventions that are out there for students with ASD are many. But what we want to do is draw from the gold star group of interventions and practices. So, what are the features of good practice? Number one, strengths-focused evidence-based interventions that target characteristics of autism. Another good feature of good practice is that there is this notion of individualized planning. So we can tailor that strategy or intervention to the need of that student. A good practice will involve collaboration with parents and collaboration with a multidisciplinary team. Another element or characteristic of good practice is that the strategy is actually going to be very supportive in the teaching environment. Another good feature is that the strategies involved will ensure new skills can be generalized in several environments and learning contexts. That also the strategy or intervention that is being selected will support the student in all activities and life transitions. Also, a good practice will have close monitoring of children's responses to the intervention, and we're able to make adjustments where necessary. And finally, a good practice will have clear evaluation techniques where we can see outcomes for both the child, the family, and the school. So on this table, on this slide, you can clearly see interventions and practices that have been given gold star. You've got some treatments and practices that are promising or emerging with scientific evidence. Then you have another group which is deemed as having limited scientific evidence. And finally, you have a group of practices that are deemed to be not recommended. So based on this review of ASD interventions, it is clear that in the Gold Star group, that intensive, highly structured programs based on principles of applied behaviour analysis, or ABA, are the gold standard for treatment. Early intervention is effective, so it is essential that the primary focus of parents and professionals is on the child's acquisition of communication, social play, and academic skills. If biological interventions are attempted, medical professionals should be involved and detailed data should be taken into account to document the effects, both positive and negative, of the biological intervention of the child. So this is where we're looking at interventions such as gluten and casein-free diet practices, which is where we need to have the medical fraternity involved. Certainly, scientifically based practices are most commonly or strongly recommended, but several interventions designated as promising may also be beneficial for some individuals with ASD, such as play therapy. Currently, interventions labelled as having limited supporting evidence or not recommended cannot be recommended as treatments for ASD due to lack of empirical support and/or risk or harm to the student. Now, in this group, you will see sensory integration, and we know that this is a practice that is currently still being used, and we do use it because of the sensory profile that some students with ASD present with. So while we see it that it has limited scientific evidence, McWilliam would argue that we can't wait until all the evidence is out there, but we would approach this intervention with caution and collect data and question and argue whether or not to continue with that intervention. Now, in the next couple of slides, I'm going to briefly discuss two frameworks that are used in some schools, and in particular to help support the needs of students with ASD. And I'm going to discuss this in the terms of applying the beliefs of inclusiveness and evidence-based. So the first framework is the TEACH framework. And on this slide, I've also provided a short video for you to look at where there is a demonstration of the TEACH approach by a young student. Now, the literature shows that educational approaches for children with additional needs have evolved over the decades, where historically these children were being treated as mentally disturbed patients and placed in mental institutions. That's been the history or the track record in previous centuries. Today, educational programs have evolved into teaching frameworks that consider that these children are educable and are individuals. A particular teaching framework that has received recognition by the National Institute of Mental Health is Division Teach. Runk, or several researchers, have reported that in this program that children's special needs are identified by direct observation and priority is given to the parent-professional collaboration in the clinical practice with structured observations and multidisciplinary training. The uniqueness of the teach approach is clearly outlined in 6 principles. First, the aim of the teach intervention or approach is to improve each individual's skills and to develop environmental adaptations to autism-related deficits. The second principle is that both formal and informal evaluation is used for designing the optimum individualized program. Third, the cognitive and behavior theory are integrated and applied to the individualized program for the child with ASD. 4, an important goal is to enhance skills and accept deficits in both the child and the parent. And so what we're aiming to do in this approach is to enhance the skills not only of the child but also of the parent. 5, given the strength of visual perception in this group of students, it is necessary to use visual structures for optimum education. This will address the auditory processing issues and auditory sensitivity of the child with ASD. And the final principle, a holistic approach in its implementation is recommended, which would require multidisciplinary training in a generalist model. So to see how the TEACH framework is implemented in a school setting, click on the YouTube link on this slide and you'll see a young girl called Alice demonstrate some of the TEACH elements that are used throughout her day at school. Now, another framework that is used in schools is school-wide positive behaviour support. And the primary aim of this framework is to improve educational outcomes for students, not just students with ASD, but for all students. It achieves this through the prevention of behaviour problems and management of existing issues positively and consistently. It also achieves this through developing skills and knowledge in the school for better teaching and learning. It also aims at creating and maintaining a better school environment for all students, teachers, and the whole school community. School-wide positive behaviour support is a broad range of systemic and individualised strategies for achieving important social and learning outcomes in schools while preventing problem behaviour. The key attributes of school-wide positive behaviour support include preventative activities, data-based decision-making, and a problem-solving approach. School-wide positive behaviour support is a technology with 4 core defining features, which are outcomes, systems, data, and practices. School-wide positive behaviour support counteracts the wait to fail model of other frameworks and moves to a prevention-based approach. Click on the YouTube link on this slide to hear Dr. George Sugai, the Chief Developer and Researcher of this framework, explain in detail the fundamental principles of school-wide positive behaviour support. Take some time now and think about the inclusivity of TEACH and SWPBS and what makes them inclusive. And why do you think some schools may adopt the TEACH framework, and why schools are now mandating the application of SWPBS in their school community?